What's up everybody, D-Man back. Welcome to a brand new video, and dude, I cannot believe it. In the year 2025, we have somehow returned to the golden age. We're doing a Shin Godzilla video. It is time to discuss who Godzilla should fight in a Shin Godzilla 2. I cannot believe we're getting to have this discussion again. Today, I will run through my top 10 answers as to who Godzilla should fight in the Shin Godzilla sequel. Let's get into it. So for those of you who don't know, I just did a major video breaking down a bombshell article which was released by Bloomberg, which gets into Toho's plans for the future of Godzilla, including the Godzilla -1 sequel's upcoming release date, or at least the release window for that film, what's going on with Godzilla the Ride, where that's coming out internationally, an upcoming Godzilla Southeast Asia project, Monarch Legacy of Monsters Season 2, and of course the major reveal, the fact that Toho is exploring the possibility of a Shin Godzilla sequel. It has been 10 years since Shin Godzilla, almost 9 at the moment, but it'll be 10 years soon. It's nearly been 10 years since Shin Godzilla, and by the time a sequel would get made, it would be over 10 years later. Which I guess raises the question, is it even worth doing a Shin Godzilla sequel, or do we even want that after the very beautiful, ambiguous ending to that film? But for today, we're going to talk about, if they do make a Shin Godzilla sequel, who should Godzilla fight? I've discussed Shin Godzilla on this channel for nearly 10 years now. I guess really it has been 10 years since I was discussing it before the film came out when they were filming it. And that whole time I was also discussing the possibility of a Shin Godzilla 2. So some of these are very explored topics I've discussed on this channel, while others of them are really ones that came to me more recently or that I have newer insights on. Let's just jump on into the list, starting out with what I think is simultaneously one of the most likely options, while also being the least exciting option, and that is the military, the government, humanity. Godzilla doesn't fight an enemy Titan. There are Titan. Get out of here, Monsterverse. Godzilla doesn't fight an enemy kaiju in this movie. It's simply another Godzilla solo film, which, hey, there's a lot of room to explore a potential Shin Godzilla solo film. Of course, Godzilla himself has the ability to evolve into an eldritch god. Godzilla could become an unstoppable force, the likes of which humanity has no ability to compete with. In fact, the art of Shin Godzilla suggested that Godzilla could develop a self-sustaining universe inside of him if he continued down his evolutionary path. That would be something that I don't think the sequel will touch upon, because how do you fight that? You don't. But that is a possibility, you know, that they go down the path of like developing Godzilla's future evolutions, simply having Godzilla take on the military. Where is the military at this point in the timeline? Do they have the Super X? Do they have some Mecha Godzilla technology? Like, where are they? I'm not really considering Mechagodzilla as part of this discussion, simply because I honestly don't think he'd be all that compelling of an opponent for Shin Godzilla to fight. Also because the thing with Godzilla fighting some sort of military technology is Godzilla has a phased array radar in Shin Godzilla. He could just doop and blip the thing offline like a Muto. Godzilla essentially has a weaponized DMP, so I don't know, and I just don't personally think Mechagodzilla would be a very compelling villain for Shin Godzilla to fight, but maybe that's just me. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down below. Also, there's the dynamic of like, what's going on with Godzilla's motivations? Is Goro Maki still a part of Godzilla? Is there some sort of influence there? Like, what's up with that? That'd be great to hear about. You could develop that in a movie with another monster, I think. I think that it would be a little repetitive at this point. After Shin Godzilla became the definitive solo Godzilla film for the modern age, and then Godzilla -1 became the definitive solo Godzilla film retelling, I just don't think that there's a reason or a need or a justification to tell a solo Godzilla story. I think it would be incredibly repetitive. It would not really push the narrative forward, and it would be like retreading the same material over and over again. I honestly don't think we need another solo Godzilla film for at least 10 years. I just don't think we need one yet. You know, maybe 10 years after Godzilla -1, in 2033, I could see a solo Godzilla film having some relevance again, but right now, I just don't see it. I think it'd be repetitive, and even Hideaki Anno seems to know that, as Hideaki Anno actually pitched a sequel to Shin Godzilla back in 2016 before the film even released. Hideaki Anno's idea was essentially for the movie to be the antithesis to Shin Godzilla, with Shin Godzilla being a very serious Godzilla film, very rooted in the real world. The next movie was going to be like this all-out Showa-styled monster brawl, leaning as heavily into the cheesy elements of Godzilla as possible, and I think the cheese factor is what turned Toho off to that idea. Next up, who could Godzilla fight? Well, the humanoids growing on his tail. We don't know much about Godzilla's next evolution, his fifth form, the humanoids growing off the tip of his tail. They are, though, external components of Shin Godzilla himself, so I think they would rather be working with Godzilla than against him, unless they wind up having developed their own consciousness and there's some reason they need to take Godzilla down, like he's a threat to them somehow. I just don't see that being the way they go. The point of the ending of Shin Godzilla thematically was that Godzilla was defeated by committee. The entire human race basically bands together to take Godzilla down, and it's just the numbers that overwhelm him. And so in order to overcome that, he must form a committee of his own. He must create the monsters on his tail to take down humanity. I see those monsters operating independently alongside Godzilla. Godzilla's tail does seem to be cooking some sort of massive humanoid creature inside, you know, that could eventually evolve into this humanoid Godzilla that's a much larger version than the ones we see growing on his tail, but I raise the question, why? What does that do for the narrative of Shin Godzilla? How does that push the story forward? What new does that tell us? The only way I could see it working is if the humanoid thing that comes out of his tail is the Goromaki part of Godzilla, and it contains the rage that Goromaki had, and now Godzilla becomes his own independent creature with his own independent thoughts and motives. Those things I could see fighting, like Godzilla taking on this Goromaki humanoid Godzilla, that could be a pretty interesting, compelling fight to see play out. That'd be pretty cool. I just don't see that being the route they go. I think it'd be a little underwhelming, to be honest with you. But I mean, like, giant god warrior appears in Tokyo showed that a humanoid kaiju like that could be pretty cool. Next up is Anguirus. I don't think Anguirus is likely at all. I simply throw Anguirus out there because Shin Godzilla was essentially the modernized version of Godzilla 1954. -1 kind of redefined how we think about that, but when Shin Godzilla came out, a lot of us kind of viewed it as basically the modern adaptation of Godzilla 54, and so a sequel to Shin Godzilla could follow the same path that a lot of people are thinking the sequel to -1 is going to follow, which is essentially taking Godzilla to just simply the next step. And for the original Godzilla, that was Anguirus, and Godzilla raids again. The reason I don't think Anguirus fits is because Shin Godzilla is so heavily a mutation. That's such a core part of the film and Shin Godzilla's DNA. His enemy should be the same. I don't think Anguirus really fits that narrative well. Anguirus, always in the Showa continuity, was essentially just a dinosaur that was ever so slightly different than his original natural form, irradiated by nuclear bombs. Anguirus was never a mutant as much as he was just an enlarged Ankylosaurus. That leads to the next monster, Mothra. A lot of these monsters you'll notice are the same monsters that I think could appear in a Godzilla -1 sequel. Mothra could be a pretty compelling monster simply because A, she's the safest play. She's Toho's second most popular monster. If you throw her in a movie, it's going to boost the box office and interest in that film because Mothra is a major draw on her own without Godzilla. She supported 4 solo films without Godzilla, so Mothra can do just well without him, so when she's paired with Godzilla, she's always a big draw. Mothra is also one of the few kaiju who's actually able to defy the mutant storyline while still having it work with the narrative. If you look at the Heisei continuity of Godzilla films, every single monster is a mutant. Godzilla's a mutation of a Godzillasaur mutated by the atomic bomb. Biollante is a human Godzilla hybrid. King Ghidorah is a mutation of the Dorats. Mechagodzilla is his own deal. Even Rodan is a mutant in that movie. Space Godzilla winds up being a mutant from the cosmos, from space itself. And Destoroyah, of course, is a mutant created by the Oxygen Destroyer. The only monsters that break the Heisei mutant trend is Mothra and Batra, the 2 mythical monsters of the Godzilla universe, and so I think Mothra could feel pretty cool here because she brings in a totally different element. You know, Godzilla's the sci-fi style, Mothra brings in that very fantasy element, and the 2 worlds clashing in the Mothra versus Godzilla storylines always work very well. The reason I don't think Mothra will appear in Shin Godzilla is because I don't think she has much thematic weight, and Shin Godzilla is such a thematically rich movie, so heavily about the 3/11 disaster and the Japanese government's response. I would expect a sequel to not touch on those topics that's already been covered, but to touch upon something else. And I don't know what Mothra could play into other than maybe themes about religion. You know, Mothra, the original 1961 movie, was very heavily about religion, so that could be a place to explore. That'd be pretty cool, I guess. But I don't know. I don't see Mothra really fitting the aesthetic of Shin Godzilla 1. Of course, the next movie could go the Hideaki Anno route of just being like, hey, we're going full crazy. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They're just going to be a monster that fights Godzilla just because. That could always happen. I don't think it will. Personally, I'm sticking to my guns. If Toho's going to develop a Shin Godzilla sequel, they're going to try and build it as a natural extension of the first movie, and so I don't think Mothra fits. That leads to Destoroyah. Destoroyah was a very, very popular kaiju we used to talk about back in the day in 2016 about how Destoroyah would fit so well with Shin Godzilla. Destoroyah parallels Shin Godzilla in so many ways. First of all, they both have multiple forms. Destoroyah is also a mutation, an abomination who carries a certain amount of rage that Shin Godzilla has. Destoroyah simply paired with Shin Godzilla would look awesome. Their red complements each other, but for me, Destoroyah feels like too big of a narrative leap to get to Destoroyah. Like, we haven't earned it yet. There's no Oxygen Destroyer in this timeline. There's no setup for a Destoroyah in this timeline. Destoroyah would have to have an entirely different origin, which would really lose the namesake. Destoroyah is named after the Oxygen Destroyer. So if you're not going to use the Oxygen Destroyer, what's the point of having Destoroyah in the first place? Also, there is the idea in the fan base that Destoroyah is kind of a final boss, and I don't think you're going to jump to a final boss in the second movie. I just don't think it's going to happen. My favorite idea, and the one that won't happen but really could, is the Gargantuas. Let me explain. In Frankenstein Conquers the World, we meet the irradiated heart of Frankenstein, which turns into the boyish monster Frankenstein, eventually killed in a fight with Baragon. Depending on the version you watch, he's killed in different ways. But some of his cells mutate and grow into the Gargantuas, iconic monsters that really have stood the test of time. They're very beloved, they're very talked about. People who have seen War of the Gargantuas love those monsters. They have continued renewed re-interest, as many filmmakers cite that film as being one of their favorites, from Michael Dougherty to Adam Wingard to so many others. It could be really cool to see the Gargantuas return, especially because one of the main core components of War of the Gargantuas is that they're afraid to fight the monsters. They're really scared to fight the Gargantuas because if they blow them up without eviscerating the cells in the process, the Gargantuas can just duplicate and regrow, and more of them can appear, and they'll be different from the last. Brown Gargantua scratches himself and it turns into green Gargantua. So what happens if those cells attach themselves to bears or fish or something else? You know, they turn into all these mutant freaks. Well, Shin Godzilla has the same idea. Godzilla's skin and flesh can regenerate into new Godzillas, but what if somewhere along the line it goes haywire? What if Godzilla's cells are blasted off and fall into the ocean? What if they're blasted off and attached to a tree or some sort of natural wildlife, and they grow into a brown and green Gargantua that Godzilla then has to fight? That would be incredible. I've wanted to see a Godzilla vs. the Gargantuas movie since I was a child. I know so many of you have as well. If we're going leaning into the Showa era, we might as well bring back one of their most iconic non-Godzilla monsters. That'd be epic. I would love to see the Gargantuas fight Shin Godzilla. They would work super well for this universe, and they'd be really interesting kaiju to pair up against Shin Godzilla. First of all, they're a little smaller. It kind of plays into that committee idea. It would really help with the idea of those humanoids on his tail. Like, it'd give the Gargantuas something to be able to fight. They don't have to be the same size as Shin Godzilla as well. They could be a little smaller, which would give them the speed advantage. They have a bit more of a humanoid aesthetic, so they could have a bit more of a humanoid relationship. Like, maybe they're a little more related to humans than Godzilla is, and so they have a bit more empathy than Godzilla does. It'd also be cool to see the Gargantuas fight Godzilla, because it'd basically be like reliving the experience of King Kong versus Godzilla, but without King Kong himself, and transplanting that onto like Sonda and Gaira. That'd be epic, man. I love Sonda and Gaira. Sonda is actually my favorite Toho kaiju aside from Godzilla, so I don't know. Am I really wishful thinking here? Absolutely, but I'm just pitching the idea because I think it'd be really cool. Next up is Biollante, another monster that we have talked about on this channel since Shin Godzilla came out. Talking about Biollante entering a new Godzilla movie has become a bit of a trope with Godzilla fans at this point, as fans are desperate for Biollante to enter the monsterverse. They're desperate for Biollante in a Shin Godzilla 2. Many people think Nautico should turn into Biollante in Godzilla -1/2. There's so much Biollante hype that somebody at Toho surely has seen it. In fact, if everybody keeps begging for Biollante, she's bound to show up at some point, I would think. Like, she's becoming really popular. Godzilla vs. Biollante was rated the highest and most well-praised Godzilla movie of the original Toho series up until Final Wars, so Biollante could have some real punch to her. She fits the aesthetic of Shin Godzilla being a mutant herself. She carries rich thematic weight both about genetic engineering and also about the nature of humanity. She'd be a really interesting counterpart to Shin Godzilla, as Godzilla himself in the Shin Godzilla movie very heavily is implied to have the spirit of a man Goro Maki inside of him, fueling him and enraging him. Now, what if we create another kaiju, one that has a female presence, something a bit more soft-natured, but that is still able to carry a human amount of rage into battle? Biollante versus Shin Godzilla would really become the fight between Erika and Goro Maki. It could be really fascinating. I would love to see that played out. Plus, she has all sorts of cool appendages. You know, those Biollante tendrils. Shin Godzilla fights super long. That could be great. Like his tail, maybe they can shoot beams of their own. That'd be sick. Biollante could counter Shin Godzilla in cool ways because she's so flexible, she's so large. She could wrap around him in cool ways. She could fight the tail in cool ways. And the acid breath would be great because it could burn away his regeneration factor. So I'd love to see Biollante show up. This one is my original idea, the one that I pitched all the way back in 2016, and the one that I've consistently stuck to, and that's a second Godzilla. Originally in the concept art for Shin Godzilla, we saw that the idea of Godzilla splitting into basically mitosis style, you know, dividing himself, that was one of the original ideas for the film. Now, it kind of seemed like that was going to be one of the ways they got Godzilla's evolutions to happen. You know, instead of just him bubbling up and transforming into a new monster, it'd kind of have a newer version of himself himself rip through the flesh of an older version of himself. But I like the idea that both could wind up becoming independent creatures, as in Shin Godzilla we find out he could spread and reproduce, and there could be thousands of Godzillas if we're not careful with his cells. So a second Godzilla appearing could be a really cool idea. It'd be a great way to get two Godzillas to fight, something Toho has wanted to do since like the 60s or 70s. This could be a great way to finally get that to happen on screen. We were really close in the 90s, but we didn't quite make it. One of the Godzillas could remain as the Shin Godzilla style, you know, retaining the Shin Godzilla design, while the other one could have a much more fresh Toho style, like a much more fresh classic Toho style, something a bit more like the Heisei series, and the two of those could go up against each other. It could be a really cool way to get a classic Godzilla versus Shin Godzilla in one movie without a multiverse going on. It could also be a really cool way to get a more heroic Godzilla, as the new Godzilla who divides from Shin Godzilla doesn't have to have the same personality or motives of Shin Godzilla, and actually Shin Godzilla really has almost no personality at all. I think it'd be great. I would love to see that. But I already pitched that as my idea for a Godzilla -1 sequel, so I'm actually going to ditch that idea as far as Shin Godzilla is related and go with the idea that everybody wants to happen in a -1 sequel, because I actually think it fits the Shin Godzilla universe better, and that is Hedorah. Hedorah could be a fantastic opponent for Shin Godzilla. This is an enemy with so much potential. I actually think Hedorah has the most potential to fight Shin Godzilla out of anybody, just in terms of like the sheer concept of it. I think that is the best idea so far. It would be an enemy with so much going for it. Hedorah could be so fast and elastic and wrap around the very static Shin Godzilla, could give him a real challenge. Also, Hedorah was a big inspiration for Shin Godzilla, both in terms of the power set and the way it developed. The multiple forms of Shin Godzilla match very well with the multiple forms of Hedorah. It's a comparison that's been drawn since 2016, before Shin Godzilla even came out. This could also be the result of something like Godzilla's cells growing in the wild in a very polluted Earth. It could tie into those environmental themes again and be like, Godzilla's cells got blown off Godzilla and Shin Godzilla, and we expected them to grow into another Godzilla, but in fact they turned into this freaky abomination monster Hedorah, simply because our world is so freaking dirty and we need to clean it. You could also play into Hedorah's acidic abilities, again neutralizing Shin Godzilla's regeneration factor. It'd be fantastic, and the two threats could continue to evolve to combat each other in new and fresh and creative ways, whereas Destoroyah really followed a linear style of evolution. Hedorah does not. Hedorah just evolves randomly, essentially. So having Shin Godzilla and Hedorah fight each other would be great. Both of them are also continually evolving. That'd be awesome. My final idea, number 10, or number 1, depending on how we're counting. My final idea is Shin Ultraman. In Shin Ultraman, we find out that there is a multiverse. They specifically state that the multiverse exists. Now, of course, Ultraman fans are quick to point out that this is actually referencing the wider Ultraman multiverse. The only reason I'm saying no Ultraman in this movie is because I would like to save that for the trilogy. I'd love to have a Shin Godzilla 2 that just simply builds the world of Shin Godzilla where it's at, and then a final Shin movie, or maybe one before the last if we're going to do a Shin Japan Heroes movie, but I don't really see a potential for Kamen Rider to crossover, especially because Kamen Rider's not massive. He's just a dude, so like what is he gonna do in that crossover if we're really gonna make that a movie? But you know what would be amazing is a Godzilla versus Ultraman movie. It'd be a little weird to have the first Godzilla versus Ultraman movie to be Shin Godzilla versus Shin Ultraman, as both of those are a little bit different interpretations of those characters, but I will take whatever I can get. Give me Shin Godzilla versus Shin Ultraman as the third and final part of a Shin trilogy, and it could be Shin Ultra 7. I get it, like we don't know where the Shin Ultra series is going. I would love to see Shin Godzilla 2 come out, and then coinciding with that we get Shin Ultra 7, and then it collides with Shin Godzilla versus Shin Ultraman, where we bring back Ultraman and have the two of them fight. That's what I want to see. That's my pitch. That's my Shin Godzilla trilogy that I would like to see. And if we're keeping track, the two that I want to see the most are Hedorah and Ultraman. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Comment down below. Who do you want to see Shin Godzilla fight? I'm so hyped we get to have Shin Godzilla discussions again. That's so crazy to me. I can't believe that in the modern day we're back to Shin Godzilla discussions, but I'm so excited about that. Comment below and let me know what you're thinking. As always, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. It is through the support of the patrons on Patreon that I'm able to continue to make videos like this for you. If you want to see more content like this, please consider supporting the Patreon, where you can get early access to content, access to the Discord community, and more. And if that's not your thing, that's alright. Like this video, subscribe, that goes a long way. And if you want to take it a step further, please consider joining as a channel member. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you guys next time for the next one. D-Man out.